it's Mo. It is March 6th, and a couple of days ago I finished the first book that I read in March, so it's time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. I do these videos every month, and I take clips of the books that I've read throughout the month, as close to when I've read them as I can, and I try to tell you a little bit about the book. I tell you whether I enjoyed it, what I liked about it, what I didn't, and if I think you should read it as well. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes, but even still, these videos end up being quite long. The first book that I read in March was In the Woods by Tana French. This is the first in the Dublin Murder Squad series, and I've heard only good things about this series. March is March Mystery Madness Readathon, and it's the Irish Readathon, so I thought this would be the perfect time to start this series. I am so glad I did. This follows Rob Ryan, who is on the Dublin Murder Squad. He's worked his way up through the squad, he's paid some of his dues, but he's still considered a kind of new and novice detective in the squad, and so is his partner Cassie Maddox. She came onto the squad, mostly a male-oriented place, and of course there were all these rumors about why she was there and that she wasn't talented, and people didn't really want to partner with her. But she and Rob hit it off almost immediately, becoming extremely close friends, almost like brother and sister, and they work really well together. They have their banter and their investigative approach and their interrogation approach down to a T. They are like clockwork. They are two halves of a whole. One of the things that Cassie knows about Rob that no one else knows is that when he was a child, he and two of his friends were abducted from the woods near their house, but he was the only child recovered. When a 12-year-old girl is found murdered, Cassie and Rob take the case, and before they realize it, they are led back to the very woods where Rob once disappeared. That's the basic premise of this book, and this book is told from Rob's perspective, and he's talking to you about the events. So he's telling you about his childhood, he's telling you about the kind of scandal of his friends disappearing, their bodies were never found, nothing was ever recovered, only Rob, half soaked in blood, turned up in the woods after the initial search. It tells about his relationship with Cassie and how they became so close and how they work so well together. And it also follows the mystery of this young girl who was found right around an archaeological dig, murdered, and displayed on an ancient sacrificial altar. The way the book talks to you and the way the book tells the story is quite seamless. There are chapters in this book, but Rob goes from talking to you directly, telling you about how he's feeling then, how he's feeling looking back on the cases that he's talking about, but then seamlessly transitions into his memories as a child, seamlessly transitions into the semi-past where he's meeting Cassie, and it's just such a propulsive read. I read the first quarter of this book over a day, and then I read the next 300 pages in one day. I didn't want to put it down. I didn't want to stop. It was so good. And the writing in this is so beautiful. Such a much more elevated writing than I'm used to in crime thriller or mystery, especially cozy mystery books. I read a lot of cozy mystery books, and when a writing style is so compelling and seamless, just beautiful. I'm not sure how else to describe it. I'm just shocked. I don't know if I've ever read such a well put together crime mystery. I was also really surprised in this book because it definitely wasn't anything like I thought it would be. I thought that Rob Ryan was going to be our main character, who was the, suave and put together murder squad detective. Maybe he's a little bit of an outsider, but he's brilliant and he makes all these intuitive and amazing connections for the case. And it's funny because this book even makes fun of that kind of character a little bit. So there is a little bit of self-awareness in this book, which is great. But Rob isn't like that at all. And this book didn't take the direction I thought it would. I thought we'd have that suave detective, like an Adam Dalgleish character. He would have his murder squad around him. He would have his collection of detectives that he used, and they would be the best at what they did. But again, that is not how this book was. this series works, very much unlike other mystery series that I've read. I'm super excited. I don't know what the next books are going to be like, but I'm super excited to find out. I definitely highly recommend this if you like crime books, if you like mysteries that have police detective elements, which I absolutely do. It's one of my favorite styles of mysteries. I would definitely highly recommend this one. If you've read Into the Woods, let me know what you thought of it, and when I read some more in March, I will come back and tell you about it. It is March 9th, and I have finished 2 more books in March. I finished The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. This is the story of 2 sisters, twins, growing up in a very small town in Louisiana. This town of Maynard is specifically known for being a black town, but extremely light-skinned black people. And everyone in the town is prejudiced against dark-skinned black people. So the Vine sisters grow up in this town, but they kind of dream of leaving it and running away. It's an extremely poor town. They're taken out of school at a very young age and have to work to help their mother raise them. Their father was killed by white men. He was falsely accused and murdered by them without trial or evidence of his crimes. And we follow these sisters throughout their whole lives. This book had an interesting way of dealing with time. It's divided into several sections, and the sections deal with each woman. But this doesn't just talk about the Vine sisters, it also talks about their daughters and how the Vine's decisions impacted the next generation as well. As we follow these women through these sections of the book, the timelines kind of jump around. We might see them as they're growing up and learn the stories of that, both the mothers and the daughters, or we might see them later in life talking back towards that, and it really just jumps all over. When the sisters finally decide to run away to New Orleans, they struggle to find work, and this story is about how finding that work creates a separation between the 2 sisters. One of them goes on to become a fingerprint specialist and learn how to read fingerprints. She marries a dark black man, and she has a young daughter. And the other sister seemingly disappears off the face of the earth because she has met a white man passing as white, marries him, and lives her life as a white woman. The story goes from there. It's about the separation of the 2 sisters, how close they were being twins when they were little. It's about what paths their lives took, whether they returned to Maynard or not, their feelings about being light-skinned black women, their feelings about the colorism and racism that they face and that their children face, and how they miss each other through their separation. This book has been compared to Passing by Nella Larson because it deals with 2 women from a small town where the majority of people are light-skinned black people, and how in passing they were great friends, not sisters, but how their lives diverged and returned together. But I think that comparing this book to Passing is not the right thing to do. If you want to read this book and maybe Sula and Passing all as a project of reading about colorism and reading stories that have strong women characters who happen to be light-skinned black women, I think that is a good idea. But this book is nothing like Passing. Yes, there are 2 women who have light skin, one of which marries a white man, but there really the differences stop. And this book really has more to do with the ongoing relationship that these women have with the world and with their children and with their husbands and with their family than Passing has to do with that. I can understand how this could be inspired by Passing, but I think comparing them did me a detriment and will do other readers a detriment because I was expecting there to be similar beats, similar storylines, and there really aren't. So I would prefer that this book be held on its own merit, which I think it is very, very good. I did struggle with this book in the beginning because I was continually comparing it to Passing, so that's why I wouldn't want other people to do that as well. I read this book on audio and it was read by one narrator. They did a great job. I'll try to put the name in the description box below because they pretty seamlessly went from the different voices of all the different characters, and especially with reading for mostly women characters, there was a lot of distinguishing aspects of each character that the reader performed, which made it easy to listen to. I don't generally like books that flow around in time so much and you're not sure like where you are and you have to orient yourself constantly, but I think that Brit Bennett did a really good job of that, and I really, really enjoyed reading it. I definitely highly recommend it, and I can see where it would be good to compare and contrast this book to other books with similar themes, but I wouldn't say that they were the same book or that this was a new version of Passing. If you've read The Vanishing Half, let me know what you thought of it. The next book that I read in March was The Sanatorium by Sarah Pierce. This was my March pick for TBR Spin. This is a long book. It's pretty chunky at like 380 some pages, but I read it in like 3 days because the chapters are very short. There's a ton of dialogue, a ton of empty space on each page, and so it didn't feel as long as the page count would suggest. This book follows a police officer who has just dealt with a very difficult case. She's had to take some time off, and it turns out that her brother has recently got engaged and invited her and her boyfriend, who is an architect, to a hotel that has recently been created in Switzerland. This hotel renovates a old tuberculosis sanatorium. Her boyfriend is super excited to see all the modern aesthetic and clean lines. Ellen is trepidatious for this trip because she hasn't spoken to her brother Isaac in quite a while. They have an extremely strained relationship, due mostly because of the death of her younger brother Sam when they were all kids. Eileen travels to the hotel despite having extreme anxieties and panic attacks from both the case that she worked and her childhood tragedy, to get answers from Isaac. Eileen and her boyfriend arrive at the hotel. Immediately, some weird things start happening, and the next day the hotel is besieged by an extreme snowstorm, and although many of the staff and guests have been evacuated, Eileen, Isaac, and her boyfriend are stuck in the hotel for various reasons. So I don't want to go too much into the mystery of this book, but it is sort of a closed door mystery in that Eileen and her brother and boyfriend are stuck in the hotel. There's a mystery to be solved concerning Isaac's fiance, and Eileen ends up needing to use her police skills, even though she's on indefinite leave, to help the Swiss police solve the crime since they can't come to the location themselves. This book was not good. This was the worst book that I've read so far this year. This felt like someone made an outline for a mystery story. They've read a lot of mysteries. They know a lot about closed door mysteries. They have some ideas. They wrote an outline, and then instead of fleshing out the outline and making it a full book, they just made that outline a book. There's so many plot holes and weird devices used. You know, one of the things is that the wind is so fierce and the storm is so strong that there's all these constant avalanches and no one can get to the hotel. The winds are too strong for a helicopter. No one can reach them. But like the phone lines and the internet is totally fine and they use it all the time. You know, things like that where it not only are they plot holes, but they're obviously just like not well thought out plots. Like it was just like, well, we need to be able to figure this out. So they have to have phones and be able to call each other all the time. Then when they can call each other all the time, they don't use the phones to like call for help when they need help somewhere in the hotel. You know, it was just really, really poorly written. This is a terrible book and I definitely don't recommend it. You can see more of my thoughts on The Sanatorium in my TBR Spin March vlog. Those were 2 more books that I read in March, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is March 15th, and I finished 1 more book in March. I finished It Walks by Night, A Paris Mystery by John Dickinson Carr. This is a Golden Age mystery, and my first mystery by Carr. Carr was an American who moved to England and wrote mysteries from a fairly young age, and he had the prestigious honor of being in like the mystery club that Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and other British people were in at the time between the two world wars. Carr was also very well known for writing closed-door mysteries, and that's exactly what this is. It is about a young man who goes to Paris and hooks up with a police chief in Paris and is kind of taken around to learn how to be a detective. It's unclear how much experience the young man actually has and how he got this connection. It seems that our detective, Ben Cullen, is taking him under his wing, that he knew maybe the young man's father, but we see everything from the young man's perspective. We meet up the night that a murder occurs, and the detective, our main character, and a psychologist are all on the premises when the murder occurs, and then the rest of the book is figuring out who committed the crime and how they did it in a seemingly closed door environment. I feel like this is a good one to go in pretty blind because it does follow a lot of the tropes of a closed door mystery, and it does have a lot of the what are now very typical elements of that, but at its time were very innovative. I did enjoy this one. It's pretty beautifully written alongside being an interesting mystery. I did guess who it was. When the detective goes back and solves the crime, it does make sense and there were clues, but you as the reader didn't necessarily know all the clues or what all the clues could mean. But I think it was fairly easy to guess what the outcome was going to be in certain elements. There were some surprises for me, which I was happy about, and it was fun to read another Golden Age mystery. I have to say that this one didn't set my heart racing. I didn't feel very connected or compelled to the characters necessarily. So I definitely would read more John Dickinson Carr, but based off of this book, he's not one of my favorite Golden Age mystery writers yet. And that was the fourth book that I read in March. It is March 18th, and I have finished 3 more books in March. I finished a short story that's called The Candles Are Burning by Veronica G. Henry. I was interested in this one because Henry writes a mystery series or a thriller series or a supernatural series, I'm not sure, taking place in New Orleans, and I had that one on my want to read list, so I was excited to read a short story by her to see if I liked her writing style. I don't know if I did. This story definitely read quite young, and I know that she does have a lot of young adult novels. I'm not sure if the story taking place in New Orleans is a young adult novel. This short story is categorized as adult, but like I said, it read very young. So The Candles Is Burning is about a young woman with a young family. She lives in the South in the maybe 30s or 40s. So although she has some rights, Black people are still very much discriminated against, and she is living in Savannah, Georgia with her husband and her young daughter. Her husband is really keen to move up north, and he brings her to a fancy dinner to tell her that they are moving to New York, and she's really upset about this because she doesn't want to leave the town. She believes in it. She believes there could be change and opportunity in the South, but her husband really believes that the only opportunity that they're going to get as Black people is going to be moving to the North. At dinner, she has a weird feeling and a semi-hallucination, and at first she assumes that that feeling is that she feels like her husband isn't telling her everything and why he's so vehement to move, but when her husband starts to choke and eventually passes away right in front of her eyes, she has an out-of-body experience and she knows that what she actually had was a premonition of his death. So the story goes on from there. She's kind of dealing with these premonitions. She's trying to figure out what she's going to do for her daughter and for herself now that her husband's dead, and she's reaching out to various people for help. She's reaching out to the pastor at her church, and she's reaching out to her friend who was once a suitor of hers and who now runs the funeral home. This story is very, very short, definitely has some supernatural elements. It was interesting, I enjoyed it, but I don't think it's exactly the kind of book that I particularly like to read, and I don't think that I particularly got along with the writing. It's not that I would never try her writing again, but I think that it was just not the most compelling story, especially out of these short stories, because I've read so many of them from authors that I really love that I've read so far. The next book that I finished was Cat by B. Cliben. This is a one-panel comic by B. Cliben, who is known for his drawings of cats. This is the 17th anniversary edition, and this edition was published in the 90s, but this book originally came out in the 70s. I don't usually talk about books like this too much, and I'm not going to today, but I would highly recommend, if you're interested in cartoons of cats, to check out B. Cliben's work. The next book that I finished in March was The Bass Rock by Evie Wyld. This is a story that has 3 separate timelines where the characters are in some way connected. So we are following someone in the current timeline, which is maybe in 2012, 2013. We're following someone in the 40s, and we're following someone in the 1700s. So in our main storyline, Viv is coming to grips with the death of her father. She's coming to grips with the mental breakdown that she had after that. She's navigating the relationship between herself, her mother, and her sister, her own behavior and alcoholism, how that connects back to her family. Since her father's death, the family home is going to be sold, and she's been asked by the family to go there, pack up items, get rid of items, and watch over the house until it is sold to a new family. Viv kind of knows that this is charity on the part of her family, that she doesn't currently have a job, that she doesn't have a lot of money, and her uncle has paid her way too much to do this seemingly small task. In the 1940s timeline, we're following Viv's grandmother as she settles into the house, which Viv is going to be now getting ready to sell. Ruth has recently married her husband. She's his second wife, and she's learning to take care of his sons, Michael and Christopher, and Michael will turn out to be Viv's father. And then the final storyline is about a family in the 1700s. They are living in the same place as the house, but obviously long before the house was built. And when we first meet them, they rescue a young woman who has been called a witch and is getting tortured and will eventually be burned at the stake. The young man that we follow is kind of captivated by this girl who's obviously been through some extremely traumatic events, and his father, who is an ex-pastor, knows that they're not going to be able to stay long in the area. And the kind of overarching watcher of all these stories is the Bass Rock, which is a rock formation out in the sea near the Scottish town where they live. So all the stories can be seen from that perspective in a way, and all touch on the idea of the Bass Rock and how it kind of silently watches over this story. But at the heart, this story is really about abuse of women, tragedy that occurs to women, and how it often occurs to women at the hands of men. And then interspersed between the stories are little vignettes of other women who have come to traumatic endings or had horrible abuses foisted on them. I read this book on audio, and those vignette aspects were actually the most difficult for me. I didn't realize till about 3/4 of the way through the book that they were not part of the actual story. I was waiting for them to connect up in some way, but they were really just the abuse, trauma, and tragedy that happened to women that the Bass Rock also witnessed. This is definitely a tough read. Trigger warnings for just about everything: rape, murder, sexual abuse, sexual assault, mental instability, mental health, all the things you can think of, really. So be warned, this is definitely not a happy read and not one to read if you are not feeling up to it. There were a lot of moments in this book of disturbing aspects and, again, sexual assault that you have to read through that are on the page. There's a lot of dread in this book, that kind of anticipatory dread that I usually hate, but there's a dreadful feeling all the way through the book too, and there's no happy resolution to any story. There's always an ambiguous nature or a destructive nature to the endings. I think this is one you have to definitely be prepared to read in a lot of ways. And I don't know if I really was. There was a moment when there was that dread feeling that you knew something bad was going to happen and you were just waiting for the shoe to drop, where I had to pause the book for a while and not pick it up so that I could then find a time where I could get through that. That's my most hated feeling in books and movies anyway, so it's hard for me to read those dreadful moments. But overall, I did really, enjoy is the wrong word, but I did enjoy my time with this book, and I think that Evie Wyld's writing is really compelling and interesting, and even when she's writing about hard subject matter or writing in a way like that dread feeling that I don't like, I want to push through and I want to find out what she's got to say and what her books are going to be about. Although I liked this one, I think that it had less of a payoff and less of a finality to the story than her other book that I read, All the Birds Singing. I think that both of them had interesting and non-typical writing techniques. So in All the Birds Singing, there were two storylines that one went forward in time, like a normal storyline, and one went backwards in time. And then in this, there were the three timelines seemingly interconnected, but then all the other vignette stories that broke up those timelines. So I think also if you're not interested in reading that kind of unique or innovative writing style, her writing might not be for you. The Bats Rock won the Stella Prize in 2022, which is kind of like the Australian Woman's Book Prize, and I can see why. I think it was really compelling and interesting. I would be interested if you have read The Bats Rock, if you want to discuss it, because I think there was a lot more there to unpick, but I think I would need to talk to someone to do that. And then the next book that I finished in March was The Death of Mrs. Westaway by Ruth Ware. This is a mystery about a young woman who lost her mother a few years ago, and she is struggling to keep up her mother's business, which is a tarot reading kiosk on Brighton Beach. She has taken over the tarot card kiosk, she's reading people's tarots, and she's barely making ends meet. She's got bills to pay, they're in the red, she's overdue, she doesn't know how she's going to pay the rent on either her tarot reading space or her apartment, and she has to pay off a loan shark that she unwisely took a loan from some years ago. While she's trying to figure all this out, a letter comes saying that a long-lost grandmother of hers has passed away, and she has been left some money, so she has to come to the funeral to collect it. Now, our main character, Harriet, or Hal Westaway, knows that even though she has an unusual name, this person could not possibly be her grandmother because her grandparents have already died. But she decides she has no other choice than to go to the funeral, go to the will reading, and find out if maybe she can scam these rich people for a few quid so that she can pay her rent. This leads Hal to discover a family that she never knew and remind herself that these people aren't her real family. The more time she spends with them and the more she finds out about the will bequeathal, she realizes that she is connected to this family in some tangential way. This story follows her kind of deciding whether she's going to scam these people or not, and what she's going to do about what was left in Mrs. Westaway's will. This is a pretty straightforward mystery of that variety, where you know that Hal's secret is eventually going to have to come out, and where there's obviously more going on than meets the eye. It was very easy to solve the different twists and turns, and it was very obvious who the culprit was going to be in the end, even right at the beginning. There were a couple of red herrings that led you to think maybe you were wrong, but ultimately you knew you were right. The tarot was an interesting aspect of this, and I liked how Ruth Ware incorporated that tarot. I like that she paid homage to both actual tarot reading as well as the idea of tarot and the occult in, like, for instance, Golden Age mysteries. She also plays homage to Agatha Christie in incorporating a poem or song into the book, but not to a really strong result. This book was way too long. It was very boring in many parts. There was a lot of repetition of Hal's predicament, and it was a lot of the author telling us what Hal was, but Hal not acting that way at all. You know, supposedly Hal was this strong person who was able to look after herself, she was able to read people, and she was able to conceal herself and her own personality from people. But again and again throughout this book, Hal proved that she did not know any of that. She didn't know how to take care of herself. She didn't know how to scam people. She didn't know how to incorporate herself into a situation that was not what she expected. She did not know how to read people. She continually made the wrong choices with who she talked to. And it was one of those mysteries where if she had just talked to a few people, she would have found out the answer right away. So that idea of her having to investigate things, she didn't really investigate very much. And even when she did, she went about it in such a terrible manner that there was no way that she was this strong, independent person. I think this will be the last Ruth Ware for me. I've read one more Ruth Ware and I didn't like that one either. The first Ruth Ware that I read, people mostly like. And this Ruth Ware, people mostly don't like. And I didn't like either of them. So I think that 2 times is the charm, and I am done reading Ruth Ware. It is March 27th, and a few days ago I finished one more book in March. I finished This Is a Bust by Ed Lynn. This is a noir mystery, sort of, taking place in 1976 in Chinatown in Manhattan, New York. New York. And this follows Robert Cho as he returns from the Vietnam War. He is definitely a change from his experience, and after a few years of aimlessness, he decides to become a police officer. He is accepted onto the force, but he is unfortunately given the job as kind of the token Chinese cop in Chinatown. So he walks a beat and he does give out parking tickets and does stop crimes as he might see them, but he is not on the track to get to be a detective. He is more used as a figurehead to go to parties and to be seen out in public, in parades, in celebrations, or at different events. He is very unhappy about this, but he's unhappy about a lot of things in his life. He's dealing with PTSD from being in the Vietnam War. He is struggling with his alcoholism, and the job not being what he wanted to is just one more pressure that he's feeling. So this follows Robert as he kind of descends into a worse and worse state, especially with his alcoholism, as he reunites with a girl he had a crush on many years ago. And as he talks the reader through the history of Chinatown in New York and about what Chinatown was like in 1976. There is a mystery, and obviously since he is struggling with wanting to be a detective and wanting to be a more active police officer, that plays a big role in this story and in the mystery that he eventually comes to solve. But I don't think this book is entirely like a mystery or a noir. It's told in a very short, clipped way. It's formatted very strangely in this edition that I have, where there's huge margins, and between basically every sentence there is what looks like a paragraph break. There's a huge space between all the sentences, so it reads very quick and clipped and short sentences, descriptions, and dialogue, but then also it reads even more stunted because of the way everything is written out. I liked the noir aspect of this. I thought it did a good job towing the line between being noir style and being a parody of noir. I liked the mystery in this, although I think the resolve of the mystery was a little hard to believe. There were definitely some aspects that felt very unrealistic, even though this is a very realistic novel. But mostly I liked our main character, Robert Cho. I liked his struggle with the idea of being a Chinese policeman when there were not many, if any, Chinese policemen on the force at this time in this novel. I don't know if that's historically accurate or not, but I'm sure it's pretty close. And I definitely loved the history that we got and the explanation of how Chinatown's formed and the feeling of the people, the Chinese people who have immigrated, or the young Chinese people who were born in Chinatown, and how they felt about the changing face of the city and ideals and ideas. This book talks a lot about like the Communist Party and Taiwan. Ed Lynn is a Chinese, Taiwanese American author, so he definitely has a personal stake in an account of these events and ideas, which I thought was super interesting. I'm always interested in how various Chinatowns in different cities are created and maintained, and how immigrants were brought to different agencies within Chinatown and then kind of distributed around the country. It's like very fascinating. So this definitely fit right in with those histories and was an interesting take on it. This is the first in a series. I think there's 2 or 3 books in this series. So I'm interested to know, especially with the ending of this one, what happens to Robert Cho in the next books, and if he stays with the police force, if he becomes a detective, if he ends up with the love interest in this book, and how that all works out. I thought there was a very interesting collection of side characters in this. He has his partner that he came up with on the force. He has a local kind of celebrity in Chinatown. He has a couple of love interests that probably are going to have something in the future books. So I think there's a lot of potential here, and I really enjoyed this one. This book was written in 2007, so if you're looking for a historical fiction set in the 70s about New York, I think this is a great one. About Chinatown or cops, detectives, I think this one was good as well. So I would definitely recommend this one, and I'm going to look out for more Ed Lin. He has a lot of other books as well, so I would read anything else by this author. And when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is March 29th, and I have finished one more book in March. Yesterday, I finished Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. This is the second Evelyn Waugh I've read. The first was The Loved One. I read that a few years ago, and I loved it. I was so taken with Waugh's wry and sarcastic style of writing. The way that he writes is a very funny, but also very dark, and I think Brideshead Revisited was very much like that as well. Brideshead Revisited follows Charles Ryder, who, when we first meet him, is a young student at Oxford, and he is kind of discovering himself, figuring out what he wants to do in his life. He's listening to his cousin's recommendations, he's listening in part to his father's recommendations, but when he meets Sebastian Flight, his life is forever changed. He and Sebastian become fast friends. Sebastian is a well-off, well-to-do young man with a family home called Brideshead. Charles is immediately taken with Sebastian and longs to be with him more, wants to know more about his family, wants to know more about his upbringing, wants to know all about what drives Sebastian. And some of the things that Charles comes to find out is that Sebastian has a very tumultuous relationship with his family. They are strict, strong Catholics, and Sebastian is as well, which is something that Charles Ryder wouldn't have initially suspected. Eventually, Sebastian does take Charles to meet his family, and this is kind of where Sebastian and Charles's relationship starts to fall apart. The outside influence of Sebastian's family, one that he has always worried about, does affect his relationship with his new best friend. And this book takes place over many years, starting in Oxford. We see all of Charles and Sebastian's relationship as friends, and we see Sebastian's eventual decline into alcoholism and depression. After this, Charles becomes very remote. There's a time jump in the book, and we find Charles married and longing for his time at Brideshead. This book is all framed by an even further time in the future where Charles is fighting in the Second World War. He has stumbled back upon Brideshead. He has revisited Brideshead as it is billeted by the war effort. Okay, so I've been wanting to read this book for a while. I've been wanting to read another Evelyn Waugh, and I have been collecting his work ever since reading The Loved One. This one wasn't as dynamic and striking and compelling as The Loved One, and Brideshead Revisited has much more of a slow, classic style. It's definitely this kind of long epic, and the look at Charles Ryder's entire life and the things that brought him joy, the things that brought him pain, and ultimately why he is quite an unhappy man at the beginning and the end of this book. This book is super well known for being made into a miniseries on the BBC with Jeremy Irons, and I actually read this book on audio read by Jeremy Irons, which was totally awesome. I have since started watching the BBC adaptation from the 80s, which is pretty much word for word. There's a couple of things that are extra, but I also know that Evelyn Waugh used these characters in other books, so it could be that some of the extra things in the miniseries adaptation were from other books and interspliced into Brideshead Revisited. But so far I'm like 2 hours in and it's basically the exact story. So if you're looking for an adaptation that's very close, so far I can recommend that one. One of the reasons I was interested in this book was because I wanted to read more Evelyn Waugh. One of the reasons I was interested in this book is because it is often referred to as a gay love story. Charles and Sebastian's relationship is never 100% fully disclosed as being a gay relationship in the book, but it definitely could be interpreted as queer-coded. There are gay characters. Well, there is one gay character who is a fairly prominent side character that comes in and out of the book, so that is not a topic or a subject that like Evelyn Waugh didn't want to write about. So there's some debate over whether this was intended to be a gay relationship or not. I think it can be read both ways. There's a lot of like a bon ami in this, that, you know, male-male friendship that could be interpreted as just that, but it definitely seems pretty queer-coded. Now, as we all know, I think everything's gay until proven otherwise, so it seems a little bit sus that so many things would be brought up and so many topics, and so much of specifically Sebastian's unhappiness, which comes a lot from his love of Catholicism, should not be interpreted as issues with him being gay. This is a pretty long book, 350 pages. I did enjoy it. I thought reading it on audio was a really good way to read it. I did follow along a little bit in the actual physical copy, which I've really been enjoying doing since I've been trying to read more of my physical copies, even if I'm reading them on audio. Another reason that I was more recently interested in reading this one was because I heard Jess, the book freak, mention that this was considered dark academia. Although I have not read much dark academia after reading Brideshead Revisited, I can safely say that it is definitely not dark academia. Does it have some academic elements? Yes, a teeny tiny bit. They are on campus for some of the time, but it's not really about the academics. It's really about avoiding academics in a lot of respects. And is it dark? Yes, but it's definitely not dark academia. I enjoyed this one similarly to the way that I enjoyed Howard's End. I felt that it was maybe a little too stuffy, a little too classic for my personal taste, but I did really like the story and I found it really interesting, and I'm super excited to read more Evelyn Waugh. I just think his writing style is so dark and biting and funny and sarcastic and dry that I want to see what he does in all different types of stories. So that was one more book that I read in March. It is March 31st, and I have finished one more book in March. I finished Murder in Wrigley Field by Crab Evers. This is a sports cozy mystery revolving around baseball, written by an ex-sports writer and about an ex-sports writer. So our main character is Duffy House, and he was a well-renowned sports writer who came up in Chicago when you could be a no one and then work your way to the top in reporting. He now lives the retired life. He's writing his memoirs, and he's super happy and lucky that he loves Wrigley Field. He has a lifetime all-access season pass to see games, so he's in and out of the ballpark almost as frequently as when he was a writer. He knows the commissioner of baseball, he knows baseball managers, he knows some journalists and sportscasters who are still working today, and one day he's hanging out on the field before a game when the unthinkable happens and the young star of the Cubs is found shot dead in the tunnel between the locker rooms and the field. Of course, the cops are called and no one can figure out how this could have possibly happened. Baseball is uprooted and upended. They cancel the game for the day and Duffy heads home. A few days later, Duffy is called to the commissioner's office in New York, and the commissioner says that due to Duffy's investigative reporting and his great knowledge of baseball and all the people involved, only he can do justice to the young player who was killed and solve this crime for the commissioner. The commissioner doesn't want this to get out into the baseball world, so he thinks that Duffy is the perfect person to quietly investigate this murder. Back in Chicago, Duffy is surprised when his young niece reminds him that she's staying with him over the summer until she heads off to law school. Of course, when his hot redheaded niece Petey finds out that he's investigating the most exciting news in baseball. She insinuates herself into his investigation and tags along for the ride. Petey and Duffy have to work together to figure out who killed this star player and do it before the killer sets their eyes on them. So this is a very typical cozy mystery in a lot of ways. It is told in an interesting way though, because it's not set in a closed area or a small town. So every person who comes up, from the victim to Duffy to Petey to all of the suspects, get their own chapter. And although suspects might come in and out of other chapters, you don't really know their full story until their featured chapter happens. I really like that idea of a way to keep the reader up to date with like what's going on and who all the characters were, especially since there is not like a closed location for the crime or the suspects to be in. I do think that that means that it was impossible to guess the culprit of this cozy mystery because it was very hard to keep track of the characters in general, but you didn't really even get to know all of the characters who might be involved or their involvement with other characters until their chapter came up. Another reason that it was really hard to tell was because this is a super baseball fact heavy book. Because Crab Evers was a writer, he very clearly puts his own ideas and opinions into this. It reads a lot of times like an op-ed piece of someone who wishes the game had stayed the way it was. If he could only see baseball nowadays. I did appreciate that Crab Evers and Duffy long for the days of slow, personal baseball when going to the park was a casual family event and it was wholesome and sweet and nice. There were day games so that kids could go, etc., etc. And like I said, if he only knew what the game has become, especially this year, he would be quite shocked. But I did think that the constant name dropping, the absolute entanglement of players and managers and sports writers and sportscasters, all these people were impossible to keep track of unless you have an encyclopedic knowledge of baseball, which I 100% do not. I would say I have an average knowledge of baseball for a non-baseball fanatic. Anyone below that would have been totally lost in this story. There were hundreds of names mentioned in this story and it made for a very confusing read. The other reason that I didn't love this book was because the manner in which it's written is a very tongue-in-cheek caricature idea of the hard-boiled detective slash reporter lingo. Lots of similes and comparing one thing to another. Lots of outdated, even for 1991 when this was written, kind of terms like, you know, saying gams for legs and stuff like that to kind of harken back to the idea of 1940s detective novels. But it was so much, it was too much in this book. And a lot of the times it just bogged down the reading of it instead of enhanced the idea of the hard-boiled reporter. I didn't mind that I couldn't have possibly solved the mystery. That really isn't the goal for me when I'm reading mysteries. I did really enjoy the last quarter of this book when all the action really takes place. There were a couple of red herrings that right at the beginning they kind of put into place and then were knocked down in the middle of the book, so I enjoyed that too. But overall, even though this is a series, I would not be seeking out the others in the series. If they happen to fall into my lap, sure. I wouldn't mind following Duffy and his niece Petey as they solve baseball crimes, but I'm not going to be looking for these books. Let me know if you've ever read a sports-related cozy mystery. It is April 3rd, and I have finished my last book in March. It was The Pale Gold of Alaska. I honestly have no clue how to pronounce his name, and I've looked it up online and I cannot find someone saying it. So I can't read the dictionary phonetic pronunciation. It doesn't make any sense in my brain the way that that is supposed to make sense and sound. So I've tried to look this up of someone saying the name out loud and I cannot do it. So I feel terrible because I really, really enjoyed this collection of short stories. If Maria Maria from MH Books or any Irish person who watches my channel can tell me how to pronounce this and say it, that would be so amazing. The point is that I really, really enjoyed this collection of short stories. Although this is an Irish writer, and although she speaks the Irish language, she also writes in English, and she translates her own work from Irish to English. I'm not sure if any of these she translated because it doesn't have a translation note in it. These stories take place in Ireland. They take place in all different time periods. They take place in America. They take place in Italy. And they kind of all revolve around women and women's lot in life. I feel like that I've read a lot of books like that recently. I think this is similar to the book You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down by Alice Walker, where each story might not be the best for the women involved. Each story might not have a positive outcome for the women, but the stories all are about women's strength. The titular story is about a woman who falls in love on the boat over from Ireland as an Irish immigrant in the 17 or 1800s, coming to America, and then realizes that that love is not what she expected and falls in love again once she's reached America and once she's gone through a tough time. There's stories about women who have affairs. There's stories about men who have affairs. There's stories about women who have affairs but then don't really care about the men that they're sleeping with. There's stories about people who fall in love due to circumstance, and then when that circumstance ends, they're still in love and their partner is not. So there's a lot of sadness and hard topics in this, certainly, but also I think it is ultimately about women's strengths. So I will definitely be keeping my eye out for more work from this author, and I definitely highly recommend this if you're looking for women-centered short stories from an Irish lens. So those are the 12 books that I read in March. It was a really interesting reading month. Some really terrible books, the worst book that I've read this year, some books that I really didn't enjoy, and then some books that I really did enjoy. I read a collection of short stories. Every month I'm either trying to read poetry or a collection of short stories, at least one throughout the month, so I got that in. I was also able to read a bunch of mysteries, which I love, some newer and some older. I got to read my first Tana French mystery, which blew my mind. I read this 400-page book almost all in one day. It was so compelling, so propulsive. I also read a new to me author, Ed Lynn, who wrote a noir-style mystery that I really, really enjoyed. I was able to read a Golden Age mystery, and of course I read so many mysteries because it was March Mystery Madness. I will be doing my March Readathon Recap coming soon, so look forward to that, so you can see how all the books that I read fit in with all the readathons that I participated in. I did a pretty good job of reading people of color. I read a classic work, an Australian author. I read 2 Irish authors. Not a lot of queer rep, although I was really pleasantly surprised that the Vanishing Half had queer rep. Overall, although I did read 2 books that I didn't enjoy or jive with, I did read a lot of really great books. And I wouldn't trade the reading experience of either of these if I had the option. So like I said, make sure to watch that Readathon recap because I definitely did read a lot of books for readathons this month. I'm finding that when I participate in a lot of different readathons, I'm only reading a couple for each readathon, so I think the recap is even more important to be able to keep track of in years to come. Let me know what you read for March. Let me know what your best and worst book were. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. So whoa, sorry mouse.